Now, analysis, in which Sarah Spencer asks if we know what we really mean by multiculturalism.
Madhura Jaffrey is now as familiar in our kitchens as Delia Smith. Our youth culture is a blend of tastes and fashion, with Afro-Caribbean music a dominant theme. We pride ourselves on being the most multicultural nation in Europe. But are we being complacent? At a more fundamental level, do we still cling to old notions of separation, where multiculturalism means nurturing their cultures for them, not for us? Leading the challenge to these boundaries are groups like Tara Arts, a theatre company which reinterprets Western classics like Shakespeare and Molière from an Asian perspective. Its artistic director, Jatinder Varma, is still fighting the kind of multiculturalism which puts people like him in an ethnic box.
I can still have comments, as I've had recently, from theatre venues who say to me, when I want to produce an Indian play, well, there are no Asians here, so I can't see who would come. We have had to fight against that, and that's one of the reasons why some of our tours take place in parts of the country where we know there are no ethnic populations. In towns like Spilsby, the audience, for many of them, they've never seen an Asian theatre company. And, of course, with that follows the fact, never imagined that Asians could speak English or could work in Shakespeare or could do Gogol or whatever other texts we're doing. Why I say that that has, from our point of view, been the most successful one is that multiculturalism is about a dialogue of difference. And one of the problems is a problem of imagination, not so much of policy. I do not think that imaginatively we have become multicultural. I think in diet we have, absolutely. But I don't think that that's translated from our stomach to our brains yet.
That requires a major imaginative leap. Even Channel 4 television, that supposed bastion of multicultural programmes, is now under fire for relegating them to so-called minority slots. The narrow multiculturalism of official arts patronage may unintentionally have served to reinforce barriers. But in recognising the value of different cultural traditions, it did at least mark a major departure from the assimilation policies of the past. Home Secretary Jack Straw.
There was a view 30 years ago that the way you developed an inclusive society was by absorption. In other words, by a policy which pretended that we were all colourblind, culture blind and religious blind, so we'd fail to recognise any differences. Now that approach has been overtaken by, if you like, a multiculturalist approach, which celebrates the differences, but sees that, the celebration of difference, as a means of achieving integration. And on the whole, it's working.
Labour first embraced multiculturalism in the late 1960s, and in this respect at least, it doesn't appear to have changed its clothes. Not so the Conservatives. 8 years ago, when Norman Tebbit spelt out his now notorious cricket test, that only those immigrants who supported the English cricket team could truly call themselves British, he represented a significant trend in his party's thinking. But when he voiced similar views at the Tory party conference last year, he was quickly rebuked by his colleagues. Guided by a younger leader, William Hague, the Tories have joined the multicultural carnival. Shadow Education Minister Stephen Dorrell.
The key thing is the emphasis which Conservatives have always placed on individuals as responsible beings within a society, and to emphasise the importance of individuals having maximum opportunity to develop their own cultural identity and to avoid the trap of believing that different cultural identities should be melted down into a kind of cultural muzak which doesn't actually mean anything to anybody.
So the Tebbit test, that minorities should be fully assimilated and accept British values, has finally gone?
Well, I don't think it's ever been true that there's been a stable identity or stable sense of what it means to be British. The British nation has welcomed wave after wave of immigrants throughout its history. My own family came here as Huguenots, as refugees from the French state, and that's true of many, many different families coming from the continent of Europe and from further afield. What has to happen, I think, in a healthy society and in a healthy culture is that the identity changes as a response to the influences to which it is subject.
So there's a political consensus at the top that the state should neither seek to assimilate minorities nor to relegate their influence to the margins of a majority culture. But is it really as easy as that? The persistence of discrimination and of racial attacks, and the rise of hostility to Islam in particular suggest that sections of the white majority at least are not yet ready to be so accommodating. Even amongst liberal opinion, there's some anxiety that too many concessions are being made to minority religious interests. And within the communities themselves, the criticism is being voiced that multicultural policies in practice serve the interests of some sections at the expense of others. The severest criticism of British multiculturalism comes from across the Channel. The French firmly reject the notion that there are any minority communities within their own borders. In France, as one and indivisible republic, immigrants are expected to adopt the values and lifestyle of French culture, each treading a strictly individual path to the only ultimate goal of becoming truly French. Professor Gilles Capel, from the Institute of Political Studies in Paris, is the author of Allah in the West, which considers the impact of very different British and French policies on their respective Muslim communities. He argues that the genesis of each system lies in its distinct model of colonial rule.
The French had this sort of ideology in their colonial empire that was to consider that the best thing that could ever happen to anyone colonized by the French was to become French one day. Something which I guess did not really exist to that extent in the British Empire. I mean, you could become British, but you could never become English. There was a sort of legacy of this intellectual heritage when each of those countries was faced with a phenomenon which it did not expect at all. That is to say that the empire strikes back, i.e. that the former colonized would come into the metropolis or the so-called motherland. And when I did my fieldwork in Britain, one of the people who traveled with me was a former British officer of the civil service and who spoke all the languages of South Asia. He was now retired. And the funny thing was that his interaction with Pakistanis or Bengalis or others whom we met in the mosques was still exactly more or less the same than the one he had when he was in the active service.
So Gilles Capel sees the origin of our multicultural system in the paternalism of the Raj. But did the Urdu-speaking members of the Indian civil service really find refuge amongst Whitehall mandarins, transplanting their system of indirect rule in order to manage the emerging minority communities in our inner cities? Like most conspiracy theories, this credits civil servants with an exaggerated capacity for strategic planning. It also ignores the fact that multicultural policies were not imposed by the British state, but often conceded, reluctantly, in the face of minority demands. Nevertheless, Professor Capel may have a point. Intentionally or not, have we imprisoned minorities within artificial ethnic boundaries, channeling their access to the corridors of power through acquiescent community leaders? Steve Vertebeck, reader in social anthropology at Oxford, is director of a major new research project on transnational communities. He argues that our political system puts too much emphasis on what he calls a narrow culturalism.
In much of public discourse surrounding multiculturalism and thereby policies promoting multiculturalism, this notion of very discrete cultures, which we often talk about as communities, as very bounded groups, is promoted. And one byproduct of this is to think of communities as somehow corporate structures that can be represented by single individuals, much as a corporation or company can be represented. And therefore we have, in the rise of multicultural policy, the promotion of so-called community leaders who are often not democratically elected individuals, people who step forward and presume to speak on behalf of this bounded cultural community. Various minority groups are compulsed to organize themselves as discrete cultural communities, particularly to get a hold of public largesse. We've had examples, let's say, in Coventry in the 1980s, where the city council came forth and said, yes, we will provide money for a Muslim community center, not taking into consideration that the Muslim population of Coventry is a very diverse group, linguistically diverse, from various backgrounds, various traditions within Islam, and therefore this culturalist notions that there was a single Muslim community, that Muslim culture was a singularity, actually backfired and led to great competition within the Muslim population of Coventry,
and nothing much came of it except great rivalry and contestation.
Is there an extent to which, under the existing model, community leaders have been used by political parties to manage those communities, actually to the detriment of the communities?
Oh, indeed. There's been cases since the 70s of local governments preferring to talk to particular members, so-called community leaders, because these members promised to deliver the vote of a given community.
The French political scientist Gilles Capel portrays this system as one in which British politicians have politicised ethnic difference for their own ends. And there are critics within the minority communities themselves who argue that by negotiating only with certain sections, and in particular with religious leaders, the system enhances their authority to the exclusion of more progressive influences. Zaki Badawi, director of the Muslim College in Ealing, was himself once the imam of London's famous Regent's Park Mosque. He agrees that the relationship between politicians and mosque leaders has sometimes been too cosy.
There is some truth in that with regard to the political parties who really go to, say, mosque officials, try to win their votes. Most of the mosque officials are of the first generation who really have very little idea about politics, except that it is quid pro quo. You say, I do service for you, do something for me. And this is being resented by the younger generation. The wider generation now are very resentful about the administration of mosques throughout the country. And they want to take over these mosques because they feel that the older generation have turned them into, say, a place of a refuge for themselves to sit there and talk in their own language and bother about their country of origin rather than being concerned with the situation in this country and with the future of the young. So there is a problem, yes. The young people need their voices to be heard. And in fact, I once said we need to have age limit to people who hold offices in the Muslim community. And we have to have language skills. You have people sitting in groups, they don't speak English properly. And then because people believe that they can get votes, they go to them.
It's not only British-born youth who feel that their voices are not being heard. And Anna Siddiqui is a caseworker at Southall Black Sisters, an organisation which provides advice to Asian women and campaigns for their rights.
Their needs are not represented by community leaders, who tend to be the gatekeepers to outside society. Often you find that women's interests are not taken up by outside agencies. One example is the way in which some arranged marriages are forced upon women. And that can involve physical duress as well as emotional and social pressure and blackmail. And we often find that agencies such as the police and social services refuse to help Asian women who are facing this problem because they say, well, arranged marriage is a part of your culture, we must respect it, we must tolerate it.
Do you accept that it can be difficult for the state and the authorities to get the right dividing line between when to intervene and when to say that's a cultural practice and we should respect it?
Well, I think at the end of the day, they have to recognise issues, for example, here of gender equality, the notion of women's rights. They cannot be put below racial or religious rights, for example, when it's quite clear that certain practices are abusive. They have to be condemned, as you would condemn abusive practices in the wider society in which you live. For example, domestic violence or child abuse or rape. Those are practices which are not acceptable in society generally. Why should they be acceptable within minority communities? But there are many professionals that we come across who would want to intervene more effectively, but often they are very nervous. They are saying, things like, I am frightened of how the community would respond, how the family would respond, the way that they feel they may get criticised for being intolerant, for being racist, and not very respectful of minority cultures.
The great dilemma of community relations is whether or not you try to break down the patterns which are natural to the communities and impose on them your own view of society. And that was always a problem representing Muslims.
Roy Hattersley, now a Labour peer, was for 30 years MP for Sparkbrook, a Birmingham constituency with a majority of Asian Muslim voters.
The constituency Labour Party, which once selected me as their Member of Parliament, was almost entirely male. And I used to say, why don't your women come? Why don't your daughters come? Why don't your sisters come? Why don't your wives come? And they used to look at me and say, that's not part of our cultural tradition.
Do you think the kind of women we're talking about would have been more successful in having their voices heard had it not been for multiculturalism?
I can't think what the alternative to multiculturalism would have been. I believe in gender equality, but I'm not sure you could have a multiracial society in which white liberals like me insist that the ethnic minorities abandon their traditional pattern of behaviour and start accepting ours. And let's be absolutely clear about this. The people who complain about how the Muslims treat women are British, enlightened, metropolitan middle classes. You've had to come to Birmingham and say to people from the southern part of Kashmir, not only do we want you to behave like Britons, but we want you to behave like Hampstead Britons. We want you to behave with a special sort of enlightenment which characterises the British chattering classes. Because the great liberals of this world, Fay Weldon, for instance, wrote time after time about how people like me encourage Muslims to exploit women, to suppress women, to depress women. I actually persuaded Fay to come to my constituency to see how Muslims really behaved, and we had a terrible confusion because she assumed that little Sikh boys with top knots were little Sikh girls, and applauded the fact that Sikh girls were encouraged to play football. We had to explain to her that it was little Sikh boys.
Even if there was a genuine misunderstanding there, the existence of groups like Salvor Black Sisters demonstrates that it's not only Hampstead Liberals who are calling for intervention, but also increasingly assertive Asian women themselves. Roy Hattersley makes a strong plea for us to educate ourselves about differences between and within the Asian communities. By the same token, isn't it simplistic to see that diversity purely in ethnic terms? Do we perhaps need to recognise cultural plurality within individuals themselves, regardless of their ethnic origin? Steve Vertovec.
One of the real problems with this culturalist understanding of multiculturalism is that it sees society as a kind of pool of discrete unicultures, rather than recognizing that individuals themselves are multicultural, that people throughout the course of their daily lives draw upon a variety of values and traits and traditions and aesthetics and all the other things we presume in the notion of culture. Rather than pigeonholing, having very restrictive modes of representation for ethnic minorities, I think the ideal model is to have a multiplicity of points of access. The goal, I would see, is making it known more widely in a kind of civil society model that through various forms of local voluntary organization, individuals can get access for their various needs and interests, not simply as Muslims or as Asians, but as teachers, as women, as students, as members of neighborhoods who have interests along those criteria as well.
But how do we break out of our existing model and create those multiple channels? The French argue that their system offers just this kind of access to individuals as full and equal citizens of the Republic. But the quid pro quo is that they must leave their community identity behind. For Gilles Capel, the very concept of minorities is divisive and undemocratic.
What is a minority? How and when and what is the borderline? And one thing which was extremely interesting for me was to follow the definition of the minorities issue in the British case. For instance, when, you had those people who were British but who were neither English nor Welsh nor Scottish, the first category, the sort of label that was plastered on them was that they were black British. And then black was anything not English, not Welsh, not Scottish. Then within the system you had subgroups. People from the subcontinent would have nothing to do with people from the Caribbean. So we would then say the category of Asian, and then within Asians people would say no, we consider that the issue of Islamness or of Muslimness is more relevant than anything else. It was just sort of an issue of Russian dolls, if I may say so. I guess that after a while it was mainly the emergence of elites who would consider that they defined a community of which they were the leaders, so as to play a role of intermediation with the global system.
Professor Capel argues that the inevitable outcome of a system which recognises such self-appointed leaders is that each of those leaders will compete for support by overbidding the other in his claim to be the genuine representative of that community's interests. It was exactly that process of overbidding, he argues, which escalated the confrontation over Salman Rushdie's book, Satanic Verses, in 1989. But one could equally argue that it was precisely because Muslims did have community leaders that a dialogue with the authorities was possible, a dialogue which averted the danger of serious violence. The Rushdie affair was a watershed in British community relations, and the results have not been entirely negative. It did open up a necessary debate and may have led radical Muslims to reconsider their approach. Zaki Badawi, then head of Regent's Park Mosque, argued at the time that Muslims should simply ignore Rushdie's alleged blasphemy, that it would be a mistake to challenge British faith in free speech. He now believes that his more militant colleagues have taken the point.
The community had learned that, listen, so we actually are going to have a position in our society where free speech will not be in any way curtailed by our community. I think they will leave that. Their protestation against things that are hurtful to them will be limited to that of the Jews, for instance. The Jews also, when some things happen against them, they make presentation, but they don't make so much fuss. And as I said several years ago, that we will develop in Britain a British Islam. That is to say, while keeping to the fundamentals of our religion, we will take the cultural aspects which are not in contradiction with our faith, will adopt them. Happily for us Muslims, we have common values in the sense that, you know, we come from the Abrahamite tradition. This culture here is a Christian culture, and therefore our values are not that different. The only thing that would differentiate between us is that in the wider Christian community, people drink and gamble and so on, and we don't. And the state is not likely to say you must gamble, and you must have a drink before driving, if you like.
Zaki Badawi is confident that there is no inherent conflict between Islam and the mainstream values of the British state. In the field of education particularly, it's easy to see why Muslims might feel that they've achieved a healthy modus vivendi with dominant Christian values. The Conservatives' 1988 Education Act, while enshrining Christianity as the dominant religion for collective worship at school, conceded that separate provision would have to be made for children of other faiths. Muslim parents and teachers were quick to seize this opportunity to introduce their own religious observances within state schools. Now that our school system respects religious difference, does the same apply to cultural aspects of the curriculum? Nick Tate, Chief Executive of the Government's Qualifications and Curriculum Authority, is seen as a strong advocate of a truly British national curriculum.
I think it's very important that the curriculum is such that young people grow up thinking that they have as much in common with each other as there are things that actually separate them. It must be the case that more time in that common curriculum is going to be spent looking at the history of the British Isles, for example, than the history of the Indian subcontinent or the history of the West Indies, because we are talking about a relevant curriculum for people who are living in Britain in the late 1990s and who are committed to being part of this nation-state for the rest of their lives. Nation-states, if they're democracies, to remain healthy democracies, ought to have some kind of common culture, in particular some kind of common civic culture. What I would want to avoid is a situation where you have radically different curricula emerging for different groups of people. It would be unfortunate if you had, if you like, a sort of a white rural curriculum emerging on the one hand and a sort of urban Bangladeshi curriculum emerging on the other.
Nick Tate insists that the national curriculum does, nevertheless, allow plenty of flexibility for individual schools to reflect ethnic diversity in the classroom. But does a concern for common values conflict with the existence of separate faith schools? Our tradition of state funding for Christian and Jewish schools has led inevitably to demands for equal treatment for Muslim schools. Earlier this month, the Secretary of State for Education, David Blunkett, finally opened the door to a long list of hopeful applicants when he approved funding for 2 Muslim primary schools in Birmingham and North London. Home Secretary Jack Straw, once Labour's education spokesperson, has long advocated the merit of that decision.
Let's compare the position of the Muslims at the end of the 20th century with the positions of the Catholics in the middle of the 19th century. There were a great many people in the British establishment who said you should not give Catholics special provision in terms of schools. Indeed, you shouldn't allow them to hold public office, because these are people whose first loyalty is to a foreign power, the papacy. Now, after a while, people said, hang on a second, I mean, this is an outrageous proposition, but also is one which is going to continue to pull our society apart. And during the last century, therefore, there was a progressive move to remove the obstacles of involvement of Catholics within British state, and also to fund their separate schools. And I think that on the British mainland, anyway, that has helped to bind our society.
Many people would have genuine fears that the result of funding separate Muslim schools will be the opposite, that it will actually encourage these children to feel more different and to move towards fundamentalism. How can it encourage them to feel more part of the mainstream if they're educated in entirely separate institutions?
Well, these children are being educated in entirely separate institutions anyway. The decisions which David Blunkett has recently made are simply to give these schools state funding. They are schools which already exist and have been funded by the parents. Now, first of all, the quid pro quo for state funding is that the state has a much greater influence over what happens in those schools than it would do if they're wholly private, in terms of the national curriculum and inspection, target setting and so on. So we can moderate as a state what happens in the schools. Secondly, it's a crucially important signal to the Muslim community that we, the state, are going to accord the 2 million Muslims the same rights in principle that we accord an equivalent number of practicing Anglicans and Catholics and a smaller number of Jews and Methodists.
Such concessions to minority religions would of course be anathema to the French Republic with its insistence on secular education. In practice, though, French secularism has always been more tolerant of Christian traditions than those of Islam. In October 1989, the same year that the Rushdie affair rocked Britain, the headmaster of a French secondary school provoked a national crisis when he refused entry to 3 Muslim teenage girls who insisted on wearing their Islamic headscarf in class. Wearing a visible symbol of religious identity was seen as a challenge to a fundamental premise of the French education system, that schools should be the melting pot of the nation, a system designed, in the words of former Minister Simone Weil, to erase all cultural and social differences. While anti-racists defended the girls' right to be different, and Muslims mobilised on the streets, the government brokered an uneasy compromise. Girls could wear the headscarf if it neither interfered with their education nor was intended as an act of religious propaganda. Because this left wide discretion to head teachers, with bans in some schools but not others, it's led to more exclusions and confrontation. Here across the Channel, schoolgirls wanting to wear a headscarf presented little difficulty in a multicultural system more orientated towards building confidence among religious minorities. In that objective, Zaki Badawi considers that Britain, by and large, has succeeded.
Yes, the British Muslims are in a much better position than the French Muslims, certainly. We here have acquired a position to have our mosques built quite easily. So we are treated on a par with, say, other religious institutions, churches, synagogues, everything. In France, mosques are regarded as centers of fundamentalism, and you get a lot of authorities there and a lot of public very hostile to building mosques. Another thing is here the British society allows for the family to operate, to develop by itself. And therefore we still have a cohesive family amongst our communities here. And that is really our main strength. To this day, despite our poverty, despite unemployment, we have not developed the criminality that is developed by other communities because of the strength of the family, more than anything else. Unfortunately, the French system does not help the family at all. In fact, it destroys the family, and as a consequence, we have a huge number of Muslims in France who have gone to criminality and extremism because the state itself do not encourage them to have their own relationship with the family. They treat the culture of their parents with contempt.
Dr. Badawi sees a happy convergence between Muslim identity and the rhetoric of family values, so popular with both the Conservatives and New Labour. But as we heard earlier from Hanana Siddiqui, the British reluctance to interfere in Asian families can lead to serious abuse being ignored. Are we also being too complacent about the future of our own Muslim youth? The signs of social exclusion and alienation in our deprived inner cities are all too evident. Riots involving unemployed Asian youths in Bradford, the growing evidence of drug-related crime and the presence of Muslim fundamentalist gangs in areas like Tower Hamlets. But we do seem to have avoided the extreme polarisation between young French Muslims, who are so culturally assimilated that few can speak Arabic, and their family elders. The situation in France, where many locally born Muslims are growing up in run-down suburban housing estates with little prospect of employment, is certainly disturbing. Tensions are fuelled by what's seen as French support for the Algerian government in its war against Islamic fundamentalism. But Gilles Kepel argues that it's simply a matter of time before Muslims are successfully integrated into French society, just as previous generations of migrants, including his own Czech parents, have been.
When you look back into history, there was very strong hostility against people from Italian origin, Spanish origin, Polish origin, and so on and so forth. The stereotypes that were used to describe them were more or less the same than the ones that were used to describe Arabs or Africans in the 1970s and 1980s. But then, because those groups were able to melt into the system, disappeared, if you wish, into Frenchness and contributed to creating the Frenchness of today, this type of prejudice against them has disappeared. And I am convinced that in the years to come, and I'm quite optimistic, there will be more and more, and there is already, incorporation into Frenchness of today and of the future of young people from Arab or African origin. And what may be seen from the outside as monocultural French culture is a culture that has incorporated all the cultures of the people who made France today. If you look at the telephone book of Paris or any French city, you will see that the names of the people come from the whole world.
This phone book theory of integration overlooks the fact that France's newer arrivals from North and West Africa don't just have foreign-sounding names. Compared with earlier European migrants, they have more distinctive religions and languages, not to mention colour differences which make them visible targets of racism. France, after all, has spawned Europe's largest racist political party, the Front National. Gilles Kepel's reliance on the phone book as his yardstick reflects the absence of authoritative statistical data on the integration of France's minorities. For if you don't recognise the very existence of minorities, the kind of ethnic monitoring which we take for granted in Britain cannot be carried out. It can actually be illegal in France to keep ethnic statistics because of the legacy of Nazi deportations of Jews during the last war. In some ways, however, the French approach may not, in practice, be all that different from our own multicultural system. In 1981, French law was changed to allow foreigners to form their own associations. Many did so, and there's been a burgeoning of new ethnic minority organisations at regional and local level. Cathy Lloyd, director of the Centre for Cross-Cultural Research on Women at Oxford, has specialised in the study of the French anti-racist movement. She points out that the leaders of these associations mediate between the minority communities and local authorities in France, much as they do here.
What one must remember always, particularly in the case of France, is to distinguish the reality from the rhetoric. I think that on many of these issues, discussion has been at a local level rather than a national level. At local level, it's possible for example, trade unions to negotiate for mosques in workplaces or for halal meat in schools and those kind of things. At a national level, once you begin to enter into the sort of national debate, you're into the rhetorical domain almost immediately, and then the workings of the rhetoric about the one and indivisible republic start to come into play.
But French insistence on assimilation clearly does preclude equal opportunities policies of the kind many British employers use to overcome the legacy of discrimination, and which have achieved a certain degree of success. In the absence of comparable data, the jury may be out on whether French-style cultural assimilation helps success in the labour market. But the paucity of black or Arab role models, in the National Assembly, in business and in the professions, suggests that it does not. By comparison, Britain does at least have a smattering of successful black and Asian people in senior positions. It's sometimes suggested that underachieving groups among our own ethnic minorities would have enjoyed greater economic success if they'd worked harder to assimilate. Tarek Madood, Professor of Sociology at Bristol, is the co-author of a recent report on the performance of ethnic minorities in the labour market.
The group that is without a doubt, the closest to the white British are the Caribbeans. And it certainly isn't the case that they're speaking the same language, having been taught very much within the same school curricula, and having the same religion as the native population has helped them to be economically successful. So cultural assimilation is certainly not a sufficient condition, and it probably isn't, strictly speaking, a necessary condition either, because I think some of the most successful, I'm thinking here of some successful Hindu families, are people who maintain a certain distinctness in terms of their families, who their children marry, who they socialize with, religious community networks, and so on.
Would you agree that it is most effective for members of minorities to concentrate on gaining new professional and language skills rather than promoting their own culture and their own language? Are they going to be more successful if they adapt and develop the new skills of the new labour market?
Of course, people need the kinds of skills that the economies and the technologies of the future of their adult lives require. But in order to learn, in order to aspire, in order to have ambitions, people need to be motivated. And one of the things I think that our current experience shows us is that people become motivated when they believe that they are respected, or where they want to, as it were, prove to a majority that actually we are as good as you are, if not better. I think to some extent we've seen this phenomenon in the case of women over the last couple of decades. And I think actually some similar phenomenon has been happening with ethnic minorities in Britain. Even amongst the poor communities, there are now twice as many Pakistani men as white men entering university. Not to mention the Asian groups that already had a very strong academic profile, like African Asians, Chinese, and Indians. So ethnic minorities are participating in education, higher education, to a greater extent than their white peers, instilling a sense of belonging, instilling a sense of participation in the cultural heritage, including minority identities, minority faiths, and so on, is part of what makes these communities successful.
So there isn't necessarily any conflict between acquiring new skills and maintaining old traditions. Even Nick Tate, with his strong belief in a common curriculum, agrees.
One of the first things I did when I came back after the Christmas break was to talk to colleagues here about what we're trying to do to save A-level Bengali, A-level Polish and A-level Hebrew, which are threatened at the moment because they are uneconomic, because of the small numbers of people that actually take them. And my line has always been on this, that one sign of a civilized society which cares for all its members is that we're actually prepared to pay a bit more money to enable languages to survive at A-level that actually help to maintain that sense of dual identity that some groups have. And often you find that if people have a strong identity in terms of the cultural subgroup to which they belong, or the religious subgroup, that often actually gives them a stronger sense of identity in the other bit of their identity. And I think there's a mistaken assumption, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why I wouldn't want us to go necessarily down the same road that the French have gone down, that if you sort of play down the other identity within society, which I think the French are probably consciously trying to do through their education system, and you have the result that you have in France with this very high level of language loss on the part of the Arabic-speaking community when they get into the second generation, I think it doesn't actually necessarily lead to that engagement and sense of commitment.
The classic example of that dual identity model is the United States, where Polish, Italian or Irish Americans draw part of their identity from their cultural heritage, but are, first and foremost, Americans. But doesn't that model conflict with the strong communal identities promoted by our own brand of multiculturalism? Tariq Madood thinks not.
The kind of American idea of hyphenated identities, which we also see in places like Canada, has something to teach us. And I think actually, without official recognition, this is exactly where a lot of people are going and have gone. And you see in London people, young people who are very culturally British and yet say they're Indian. And theorists sometimes use the term hybridity to describe this condition, and that nobody is purely belonging to one community or another because we're all so interested in each other's lives and wanting to create a synthesis of these influences in our own. I think that we are seeing a degree of hybridity that probably 20, 30 years ago we would have thought unlikely. The degree of mixing that there is amongst young people. I mean, for instance, half of all British-born Caribbean men who have a partner have a white partner. So clearly, in terms of friendships, social life, cultural influences, we're living in a very mixed, hybridic condition. But on the other hand, we also have communities that want to preserve something distinctive about themselves. And on the whole, these tend to be religious-based communities. And I think we should create a multiculturalism that is happy with hybridity but has space for religious communities. We shouldn't say to people who value religious community, oh really, you've got to be a hybrid, and we shouldn't have to say to hybrids, oh, you have to clearly fit into one community or another.
The important thing then is to allow people to make their own choices about whether they want to be hybrids or to emphasise their separate identities. And that applies equally to members of the so-called majority community. There may, after all, be one positive lesson we can learn from the French aversion to minorities as a concept. And that is that multiculturalism shouldn't just be about what we call minorities, but about the whole of our society. Are we all drawing as much as we might from Britain's cultural diversity? Whether we like it or not, our notions of majority culture and common values are being challenged. And it's not just minorities who are forcing us to reconsider what it means to be British. The European Union and Scottish and Welsh devolution equally require us to adapt our perceptions of this nation-state. Traditional British identity, once encapsulated by church, monarchy and an undefined Englishness, has been unravelling since the loss of empire. Bikku Parekh, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Hull, has watched this process over 3 decades. Acknowledging that multiculturalism has contributed to it, he argues that we should see this not as a threat, but as an opportunity for us all.
Britain is bombarded, if you like, by a multicultural wave, both from within and from outside. It therefore has to evolve a sense of identity which takes account of these extremely important facts. Common values have to be periodically redefined. We would need to think of common values in a more negotiated kind of way because they are being contested.
So you're contrasting the earlier position where essentially the majority determined the common values and the minority had to comply with a future vision in which the minorities are sharing in the negotiation as to what those values are?
Yes, no, I would in fact go a little further. And I would say that what we take to be values of majority today were a result of a long process of coercion, political and economic, which is involved in state building, long process of ideological indoctrination. So the majority values today were once minority values. So the first thing is we'll have to deconstruct the very notion of common values, the content of common values, how did they come to be there? And then I would say that once that deconstruction takes place, then we begin to see that common values are not given. They are part of a process. Now, if they are part of a process, then that process can go on.
For better or worse, we live in an increasingly cosmopolitan and globalized world. The process of adapting our values may not be easy. Multiculturalism has provided some channels for negotiating a new dialogue of difference, but it will have to break out of the narrow parameters set by some of its own gatekeepers. If we can make that imaginative leap, there may be a crock of gold at the end of the multicultural rainbow.
Analysis was presented by Sarah Spencer and produced by Zarir Masani. The editor is Nicola Merrick.